all right, ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, we have ourselves another episode of Debate Sensei, and this time we are focusing on NFA LD and how do you prepare for the first tournament. Now, I can tell you from experience as a coach, if I were to have a a student that came up to me and was like, I really want to do NFALD. And it seemed like they were committed to do it. That would be my first NFALD tournament ever, I think. Yeah, and so this definitely is something that I'm interested in as far as uh, just how the approach is. And so I'm wondering if we started with that. What if you had a coach that had not only like this is their first tournament of the season, but it's like, all right, I'm getting started in NFALD for the first time. How do I get prepared for that first tournament?
Yeah, Jared, it's a great question. I'm super excited to be here and kind of get into some of the more nitty gritty of the strategy of an FALD and debate in general. Okay, if I had a coach that came to me and was interested in, what do I do for my first tournament? I'd honestly have a lot of questions with regard to the composition of that team. Are we talking about one student and one coach? We're talking about a group of students and one coach or several coaches. The composition of the team, I think, makes a huge difference in terms of what preparation strategy you'll take before the first tournament. So, the first piece of advice that I would have for anyone with regard to preparing for the first tournament would be to do a little bit of self-assessment in regards to what your team looks like and what the resources are for that team moving forward into the first tournament. I would encourage that coach to pick a tournament that was a target first tournament for the team. It doesn't have to be, if the tournament says they're the season opener, it doesn't have to be that tournament. It could be a couple.
It might be a little early, huh? I mean, like especially if it's like one coach, one student, like that might be hard to get everything you need together by that time. Would you say that there's a good sort of middle ground for like if you had just one student in your first tournament, how much time do you think you should leave yourself to be prepared for that?
I like to at least have a month.
Okay.
So basically, I think that if you have a month, you can think about it this way. You can do two, larger research assignments that take around 2 weeks, and
Okay.
be ready for that first month with the materials that you have. Breaking it down, once you kind of get like an assessment of where you are as an organization and which tournament that you're going to, I think that the biggest question that you have to ask yourself is, what are the ideal debates that we want to have at this upcoming tournament? What do we want our 2ARs to look like? What do we want our 1MRs to look like? And then to plan backwards from that point to sort of like create complementary pieces around what you kind of want your final speeches to look like. So if we're talking from the AF perspective, a lot of folks are going to start, their preparation for a tournament, especially the first tournament with the AF, and I would really encourage that. And if I had, like a young team, I was starting a team from scratch, the thing that I would do for sure is I would focus so much on the AF. So the advice I got from a coach when I was first starting out was your students are AF half the time. The AF never changes. And in those tournaments, if you win all your AF debates plus one neg debate, you're going to break, right? So if sort of like your goal is to build up towards the point where you can clear at tournaments, the best and easiest way to get that done is to be amazing at the AF and then to eke out one neg win. So if you can sort of focus initially on the affirmative, I think that is like a really good place to start.
Okay, so on the are there So I know that there are camps and they produce a lot of evidence. Do you think that using that, just the sort of the stock or the affirmative that came out of that, does that put you at a disadvantage because a lot of people are aware of it?
I think it depends on what your goals are as an organization for that first tournament. So, if your goal for your first few tournaments is to maybe clear or maximize your competitive outcomes at that tournament, maybe have some hardware or something to report back to
Oh,
your
oh,
administration
gotcha.
that
Okay.
like this new endeavor that you're getting into, is like worth it and good. Then honestly, no, I wouldn't use that affirmative.
Right. So maybe like so a little perspective about how you're going into the tournament. It's also something that you definitely want to do, where it's like I just want to hear what people are saying. It might be a good goal. It's like I just want to. So even if you do walk in with the affirmative that some camp cut for you,
Mhm.
you're not necessarily, you're not going in there thinking that you are going to be highly competitive, but it's more about sort of getting and in that situation maybe you would be able to go to one of those season openers, just to get a feel of where the community is at on this topic. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of folks, I think there are some teams that definitely take that strategy. If I would highlight one smaller program that I think does an amazing job at this, it's Central Michigan University.
Okay.
They've had a lot of success with not a very large team, and for the most part, just one coach. And something they do that I think that's really interesting is they will basically pick an affirmative, and they'll run that affirmative the whole season from
Oh,
day one until the very end of the season. It won't change very much. And what I'm kind of getting from their approach is they're one, intelligence gathering. So they're getting sort of like a sense for all the arguments that are on the topic because, everyone's kind of throwing the box at this affirmative because, it's really predictable.
right.
And then two, they're developing really good skills. They're really good at helping their novices make the jump to varsity and get good fast because
Huh.
they're having debates where their opponent is really prepared. Especially if you're talking about novice and JV divisions, if you kind of want to like zag where others are zagging and run something a little off the wall, you'll probably rack up a lot of wins, especially early, because folks without a lot of experience aren't going to have a good sense of how to handle that, and you're
Right.
going to get some wins. But I found that those students aren't as prepared to make the leap into the varsity division or to have the
Right.
success later on in the season because they don't have the experience of those debates against a well-prepared opponent. So, but I understand that there's the need to sort of balance those approaches, right? Like, it would be hard to start a new team or to have a smaller program that just didn't have anything to show for a whole semester. And there's also a qualification process for the National Forensics Association. So you also do want to get your qualification to NFA so that you can kind of guarantee that you got some folks that are going to nationals. But I think to the extent that you can, picking the debate that is the most predictable for your opponent so that
Hmm.
your early season debates are actually good debates and challenging debates, I think that helps you a lot more as the season progresses.
Okay. Like, we'll in future episodes, we're going to get into some of the particular affirmatives, but off the top of your head, are there some that were coming out of camps that are pretty well known, that you're not really spoiling anything by letting people know?
Yeah, of course. So I think a lot of the most popular ones either focused on a particular component of the nuclear triad. So the
Okay.
nuclear triad being America's intercontinental ballistic missiles,
Hmm.
nuclear submarines, and then bombers.
Okay.
And the affirmatives that I saw focused on reducing the reliance of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the nuclear triad. Uh,
Oh,
those are, the most old school component of our nuclear force posture.
okay.
When you think about, nuclear weapons, most folks, they have some awareness, are going to think of like a bunch of military guys in a hole somewhere in Nebraska, right?
Yeah.
Like with, their finger on the button at any time in the world. And that's kind of what ICBMs are. I mean, there literally are bunkers spread throughout the Midwest of the United States where there are folks who are on alert, high alert every single day, both protecting those silos and also prepared to, I guess, launch if the president were to give authorization for a nuclear strike. So there's a lot of literature that speaks to, phasing out those components. And I think it's popular as an affirmative because you can kind of take both approaches with it as an AF. So one, you are reducing our nuclear weapons stockpile, so you are getting some of those arguments related to making it less likely that there'd be miscalculation, maybe, creating some space for our adversaries to de-emphasize nuclear weapons and their posture. But as they are older missiles, you're also getting some of the, perspectives that support nuclear weapons.
Right.
We aren't supporting ICBMs.
Right.
We're supporting more advanced nuclear weapons in other areas. So there's a little bit of like both sides that you can kind of do with ICBMs. So I think that made it kind of popular.
You could call it the Superman 4 plan, right? I mean, that's the good old Christopher Reeves movie. He just gathers them all up in a net and throws them. That's the method, the mechanism.
I'm sure someone will maybe have some creative ways of incorporating some Superman references. We'll get some good speaker points, I think, from the older folks.
Yeah,
do that.
Oh man, that's always fun. That's always entertaining when people just kind of throw some pop culture references into it. Just have a little fun with the debate. Kind of realize the position that they're in is you kind of doing this little rhetorical exercise in front of people, and so having some fun with it. It's not bad. You said something about people. You're hearing responses, and now you get to sort of take stock of the answers that people give, particularly how nuclear weapons might have some sort of benefits to them. My thought was, oh man, do you think that like the realpolitik neg is something that is going to be popular or something to prepare for?
My experience, especially in NFA LD, suggests that it will be less popular than I think.
Okay.
So in my experience, with NFA LD, you're speaking, to a demographic that is a little less likely to take some of those conventional routes. So I actually think that, some perspectives that really emphasize the more critical angles on the resolution will kind of be emphasized.
Right.
So, I think that rather than a lot of negatives, just kind of being straight up, like realpolitik, nuclear weapons are good. I think most of them are going to try to, as we say, out left the affirmative. They're going to try to say, the way that you've gone about trying to get away from nuclear weapons, doesn't do enough to accomplish that goal, and maybe in some ways inhibits us from achieving more egalitarian and universal goals of disarmament, etc.
For the first tournament, do you think there are? So when people come into the first tournament, do people typically come in with those critical positions, or is there some time in the uptick where you're kind of going with some of those realpolitik and like mutually assured destruction arguments just because the literature's easy to get, and like is that something that's common, or do people just avoid it entirely?
I think that can depend on the student, because I mean, even newer debaters are still college students, so
Right.
they probably have like a major. They probably have some level of research interest already, and so if their interest and their research goals kind of align with that critical side, I think a lot of folks are just going to come in, and that's going to be their initial approach. They're going to have a critical angle on the resolution, and I think the folks who are maybe a little overwhelmed are going to be the ones that kind of go that immediate conventional route. And then also, I mean, the folks who, their interests and like sort of goals and priorities do align with like engaging in the more conventional literature. I think those folks are going to, be really interested in taking taking on those real politique and
Right.
mutually assured destruction roles. So in my experience, the student itself will kind of guide that process, and then also the team. Every team's got back files and
Right.
a history of their own in terms of who have been the successful debaters that have come from that team, who have built up that program, who have built up those files, and are teaching the younger generations, what successful debate looks like. And so teams that sort of like emphasize those critical approaches, I think, are going to be super invested.
Oh,
I think the best debaters are flexible. Like the best debaters are going to be able to approach the resolution from the perspective of a critical angle. They're going to be able to go for topicality. They're going to be able to also defend in a conventional sense nuclear weapons. And so I think those are, generally speaking, the debaters who find the most success, the ones that take a more generalist approach to the topic.
Oh man, yeah, having some back files is just indispensable. It's so valuable. So it's interesting that not just what students you have on the team, but what students you did have on the team years ago might affect your current ability to be successful. That's such a fascinating and sort of unknown part about debate, especially with topics that are one for an entire season. Season long topics have that ability. Let's think about some teams that might not have back files, and now they're approaching their first tournament. They've picked out an affirmative. Maybe it's just cookie cutter. Maybe it's something simple. I think that I would be way more lost on how to strategize the neg than I would the AF, especially with like zero back files. If you were challenged with that sort of approach, where do you think the starting point would be for that coach?
So I think the first thing is that as a coach, if you have the time, and I mean, I don't want to impose a lot of additional burdens on young coaches or new coaches, especially if they're not receiving large stipends or compensation for being the debate coach. But to the extent possible, I would try to do some reading on the resolution, do some reading on the topic beforehand, even if you're not cutting cards. Just having a general awareness of what the different topic areas under the resolution are. And I would basically start dividing up the resolution into kind of categories, Okay. So affirmatives that reduce the number of nuclear weapons that we have. Affirmatives that reduce, one part of the triad. So you've got sort of three areas that reduce ICBMs, that reduce submarines, that reduce bombers. Affirmatives that focus on our positive assurances. So by positive assurance, I mean places where we've promised to use nuclear weapons in defense of other countries. So, we have positive assurances, with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, South Korea, Japan, Australia, Europe, though that covers most of NATO. So, affirmatives that would reduce or eliminate some of those positive assurances are important. Then there's a whole component in the literature on nuclear disarmament. There's a recent treaty called the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that has been signed by all the countries that don't have nuclear weapons.
Okay.
So, not necessarily enforced in terms of international law, but there's a lot of reading on that, right? So you get these categories, and you basically, what I do is I call it, a mind map. And, I either do it myself or ideally, you're doing it with your students and you're just kind of brainstorming, right? What would our response look like to this? And the main thing I'm looking for, especially early, is what are the connections that I can create between these different categories so I can write positions or arguments that kind of cut across a lot of different categories. So I invest, the finite time that I have in the way that is the most likely to be relevant for debates. Because, nothing is worse than going to your first tournament and you spend a ton of time, researching, X affirmative. And then that affirmative isn't run there, isn't run the next tournament, never gets run. And so you win.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, like, because on the neg, like sometimes it's hard to find more than one disadvantage, or like a fully formed disadvantage with supported by literature and things like
Mhm.
that. And so, man, people walk into a round and they got 3 minutes of relevant material. Do you ever prepare just filler stuff just to kind of like, it's like, okay, if you don't know what to say, you could always say this on the neg specifically. The affirmative, you should have your full time planned out, but on the neg, like the ability to be flexible and say things that are relevant to the debate is more of a challenge.
Yeah, so I think that you want to prepare arguments that are as generic as possible.
Mm,
And you want to find evidence that is as generic as possible. And judges are going to critique you for it, right? Like,
right.
judges are going to be like, oh, these cards are generic. Or I remember last year, we got like a lot of flack because our disadvantages were like short. But like,
Oh,
there was like a method to the madness, right? Like, um, we want generic short arguments because we don't know what the affirmatives are going to look like.
right.
And we want to, like I said, not waste time trying to, find super specific arguments, super in-depth arguments that are like, like the best representation and version of those arguments right away, because we have no idea if they're going to work or not. And so if you're in a season-long topic like LD and college LD and policy, what you want to really be doing is that you want to be using the information that you're getting from each tournament to refine what you have. But for your first
Mm,
tournament, I mean, even we have an established team that's pretty big with a lot of people that are like doing research and cutting cards. We're not trying to like cut a huge file against any particular affirmative. We're just trying to get a little, like to make sure we have a little something
yeah.
against every part of the menu that we think will exist at the first tournament. And then from there, like we're adapting and trying to, modify and change files and cut new files based on, what is run. But yeah, to me, and there's a lot of tools at your disposal to make sure your arguments are as general as possible. You mentioned disadvantages. The disadvantage should apply to like everything. If you want a disadvantage, it needs to be capable of
Yeah.
being run against really any affirmative. Critiques, I think, are really popular early because they accomplish that goal, right? Like,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
are applicable to pretty much every affirmative. And so a lot of teams, I think a lot of teams tend to be honestly the opposite of what you kind of mentioned. I think they tend to be more critical at first and
Oh.
then become more specific and case
Oh,
relevant
really?
as they go on
I see,
because
because the critique can link to so much. They can really kind of explain that link level. That's
yeah.
interesting. And so you in your experience, it kind of like gets more policy oriented as the season goes on.
Yeah, I think so. Especially
In
like
general, not as a universal rule, but wow,
yeah,
that's okay.
and,
That's fascinating.
if you're a small team, I think the approach that
Oh,
if the approach you should take is you need to like find the best general negative argument that you can find, right? Like, and that's your ideal. Then maybe you're writing some complementary pieces. If you have a disadvantage, maybe you're writing a topicality argument that forces the affirmative into linking into that disadvantage. For your case arguments, you're just trying to find impact defense to every impact except for the impacts that disadvantage has, right? You're just kind
mm,
of building what you're going to do for those 7 minutes around collapsing into that disadvantage, right? And then if that argument is good and you find that it's successful, especially if you're a smaller team, what I would do is I would basically try to just get good at the technical components of execution and then
okay.
kind of just make a list. Okay, so like who are the people and what are the affirmatives that are on this topic that we don't think that we can beat with this disadvantage?
Oh, okay.
Let's say it's a critique. Who are the people that are so good at debating generic stuff that like we think that we're going to need to invest some time into doing like a really robust case negative to their affirmative, and then are there particular affirmatives that are getting run on the topic that are super strong against our, generic argument, and maybe we need to like cut a different strategy against that affirmative. But basically, yeah, I think that you really just want to do that. And, I think it's all about assessment. I'm really big on assessment. So, like one thing that, we ask debaters before a tournament is to look at the entry list, right? And to kind of go, okay, based on this entry list, especially if they're experienced, where do you think you're going to finish, right, in prelims? What do you think you're going to go in prelims based on who's going to this tournament? If they say like 4-2, okay, that's great. You're going to go 4-2. So to improve your position in elims, you want to go 5-1. Okay. Right. So if you are going to go 5-1, what can you do to sort of like change that round 5 and round 6, where ostensibly you've gone, 4-1 or sorry 3-1 with the presets and winning 1 or 2 of your paired power debates? What can you do? Are you going to break a new affirmative? Are you going to like look at the list of people and kind of figure out who's likely to be in the up bracket and do like a lot of negative work against their affirmative, right? Like, how can you get one more win in prelims? And especially like once you get to the point where you can break at tournaments, that's kind of what you really want to start gearing your strategy towards. How do I get one more win in prelims? So I'm not a 3-3-4-2 debater. I'm a 5-1-4-2 debater. And then I'm a 6-0 5-1 debater, right? And so then if you're making it to quarters, how do you make semis? How do you make finals, right? So I think having some self-assessment and then targeting your efforts at what you can be done to like improve one round past where you are is like a good investment of resources.
Does NFA LD have a pretty good judging philosophy, accessibility to people's written judging philosophies?
Usually, yeah. So a lot of tournaments are on tabroom.com. So the judging paradigm is just attached to that judge. And then most tournaments definitely like, if not require it, like outright encourage it. I think the places where NFLD is different from college policy is that you will get judges who you just don't have that much experience, or are maybe from other communities and haven't judged this topic or haven't judged LD before. And so there is that element where you may have to adapt, you may have to change, what you're doing on the fly in order to be successful.
Okay. Yeah. So, and you were talking about how early on, a lot of people like doing sort of generic critiques. Now, does that mean, it sounds like on the affirmative, they should be putting some time into answering these generic critiques? Are there resources already out there? Do people have that sort of already ready to go?
So first, for generic stuff, I think I would use some high school resources, like from high school policy. So like there's like the Open Evidence Project. But college is definitely like a less it's a little bit more dog eat dog with that, if it makes sense. And that's there isn't as much historical records of like debates. There isn't an open evidence for the NDT. There isn't one for college LD, right? So the best you can do is you can look back at previous case lists. So you can just kind of see like what was read in previous debates. And then a lot of stuff that, would be at least very general from high school policy would be pretty relevant. But, that's a great point you made about how in the beginning of the season, preparing for generic debates is really important for the YAF. Because, I always say to, our people who are thinking about affirmative, it's like, you can't just prepare for convenience, right? Like every YAF, their dream scenario is that they get the pairing, the NC goes, it's like a bunch of predictable solvency arguments, the generic just on the topic, and a T that they clearly meet, right? And that's what honestly most people like prepare for. They prep their front lines for solvency, for et cetera, right? You really have to start thinking about, the negative is not trying to make your life easy. The negative is trying to make your life as hard as possible, and to shift the debate's focus from the content of the affirmative to some other content that they think that they know better than the YAF. So preparing your affirmative for those debates and preparing your extensions and front lines to be relevant in those debates, I think is an important consideration.
Not only are they not trying to make your life easy, but they are trying to make their lives easy. And like you said before, that like the critique tends to be a bit more broadly applicable to more AF cases. So of course, strategically, like you should expect that. You should expect them to be creating those positions, and therefore, like now, you know, ironically, it becomes an arms race, basically.
Right.
Which is,
Well, very much so. Yeah.
yeah. Whereas, like, all right, well, if you're going to come up with generic arguments, I'm going to come up with generic responses. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. That's really, man, that has been really helpful. Those pieces of advice about because when I start preparing an affirmative, I'm like, ooh, this one is susceptible to that disadvantage, which I know exists.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean that people, the only way that people would be able to research that is if they knew it was coming, and they don't necessarily know what's coming. And so maybe at the second or third tournament, they're going to have those responses. But at this first tournament, you should really be expecting more sort of like critical, broad-based approaches. That's good advice. Good advice. Chad Meadows, Director of Debate, Western Kentucky. Thank you so much. I can't wait to talk a little bit later. What do we got on our next one? That when we come back, we're going to be, how to prep for the first tournament. Right. So the next one that's going to be broadcast is we're going to be doing a Western Kentucky tournament recap, at least when it gets published. Okay. So I can't wait to see where people are for that one. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to doing some more of these with you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you.